The gas station security camera captured everything at 2:17 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in September. A woman in a wheelchair, 41 years old, her dark hair pulled back in a braid that had gone loose from the hours of travel, her hands raw from pushing herself across the parking lot, had parked near the entrance of a Shell station outside Barstow, California. She'd been on the road for 6 hours. She needed water. She needed to use the restroom. She needed, more than anything, 30 seconds of kindness from a world that had not been generous with it lately. What she got instead was 3 men in their early 20s who thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever seen to grab the handles of her wheelchair while she was still sitting in it and spin her around until she screamed. And when she screamed, they laughed harder. And when she tried to grab the wheels to stop herself, one of them leaned down close to her face, close enough that she could smell the beer and the cruelty on his breath, and said something so vile that the woman behind the register inside the station would later repeat it to police with her hands shaking and her voice barely above a whisper. Then they took the wheelchair. Not because they wanted it, not because they had any use for it. They took it because they could, because she couldn't run after them. Because watching her try to follow on the burning asphalt of the parking lot, dragging herself on her hands toward a chair she needed to survive, was apparently something worth laughing about. They tossed it in the bed of their truck and drove away. And the woman, whose name was Rosalie Vega, sat on the ground in the September heat with her palms scraped open and her pride in pieces, and cried in a way she hadn't cried since the accident that had taken the use of her legs 3 years before. She cried the way you cry when you realize the world doesn't just fail you sometimes. It fails you on purpose, with an audience, while it laughs. What happened 40 minutes later? What a man named Thomas Bonesaw Briggs did when he pulled his Harley into that same gas station and saw a woman sitting alone on the ground with blood on her hands. That's what this story is really about. That's the part that matters. Rosalie Vega had not always been the kind of woman who cried in parking lots. She had been, for most of her 38 years before the accident, the kind of woman who made other people feel steadier just by walking into a room. She was a physical therapist at a rehabilitation center in Fresno. She spent her days helping people relearn how to move through a world that had stopped making sense for them. Stroke survivors, accident victims, people whose bodies had betrayed them in sudden and spectacular ways. She was good at it. She was patient and precise, and she never, not once in 11 years of practice, let a patient feel like their struggle was anything less than an act of profound courage. She had a daughter named Adriana who was 13 and building rockets out of cardboard for a school science fair. She had a mother named Carmen who called every Sunday at noon from Albuquerque and talked for 45 minutes without pausing for breath. She had a house with a garden that needed more attention than she ever gave it, and a bookshelf so overfull that books lived in stacks on the floor and the windowsills and once, memorably, in the bathroom sink. She had a life that was not perfect but was hers. Completely and solidly hers. Then came the intersection of Highway 99 and Manning Avenue on a Tuesday evening in March 3 years ago, and a driver who ran a red light doing 55 miles an hour, and an impact that Rosalie remembered in flashes even now. The sound, which was not a bang but a tearing, like the world itself splitting open. The smell of something burning. A spinning sensation that she later understood was the car rolling. And then nothing. A blank white absence of everything. Until she woke up in a hospital bed and a doctor she'd never seen before told her that the damage to her spinal cord was significant, and that she needed to begin managing her expectations about what her recovery would look like. Managing her expectations. She had never hated a phrase more in her entire life. Rosalie spent 4 months in a rehabilitation facility, irony being what it is, one that was not entirely unlike the center where she herself had worked. She was 50 feet away from the wing where she used to help other people rebuild themselves, and she lay in her bed at night listening to the sounds of the building and thought about all the things she'd said to patients over the years. About strength, about resilience, about the body's remarkable capacity to adapt. She thought about how clean and confident those words had sounded coming out of her mouth, how absolutely certain she'd been when she said them, and how completely hollow they felt now from the inside. She did not feel resilient. She felt like something had been taken from her that could never fully be given back. But she also, and this was the thing about Rosalie Vega that the people who loved her understood and that strangers often missed, she also got up every single morning and did the work anyway, even when the work felt pointless. Even when her arms shook during transfers and her hands cramped from pushing, and the world seemed to have been redesigned specifically to make everything she needed to do approximately 30% harder than it needed to be. She got up. She did the work. She moved forward. Not because she wasn't afraid, not because she wasn't angry, because she was her mother's daughter, and Carmen Vega had once told her that the bravest thing a person could do was to keep going when giving up would be so much easier. Rosalie kept going. She modified her house. She returned to work, part-time at first and then full-time, because her patients needed her and because she discovered that helping other people navigate the same terrain she was navigating herself gave her work a depth it had never quite had before. She learned things about accessibility and barriers and the particular exhaustion of having to fight for basic dignity in spaces not designed for you. She became, if possible, an even better therapist. Because now she wasn't just educated. She was educated and she had been there. She joined an online community of wheelchair users that met virtually every Thursday evening. She let her daughter help her in the ways that Adriana needed to help, without letting that help tip into something that would make Adriana feel like she'd lost her mother and gained a patient instead. She called her own mother every Sunday at noon and listened to 45 minutes of Carmen's voice and felt grateful for every single second of it. She was, 3 years out from the accident, something that looked a lot like okay. Not the same okay as before, a different okay. An okay that knew more about loss and limitation and the particular weight of a world that is not built for everyone, but okay. And then September. And the drive to Los Angeles for Adriana's regional science fair competition. And the Shell station outside Barstow where Rosalie had stopped because the heat was brutal and she needed water, and she'd been pushing herself since early that morning and her shoulders ached and she just needed 30 seconds of a normal stop at a normal gas station like a normal person without anything going wrong. 30 seconds was apparently too much to ask. She didn't know how long she sat on the ground after they drove away. Time did something strange in the immediate aftermath of humiliation. It stretched and compressed at the same time so that each second felt endless, and yet somehow an entire half hour could vanish without her noticing. The woman from inside the gas station, her name tag said Peggy in faded letters, and she had the look of someone who had worked long shifts in difficult places for many years and had stopped being surprised by the worst of people without ever quite losing her capacity to be horrified by them. Came outside with a bottle of water and a paper towel and crouched down beside Rosalie with the careful gentleness of someone who understood that right now, this moment, this woman needed to be treated like a human being more than she needed almost anything else. "I called the police," Peggy said. "I got the license plate. I got them on the camera." Rosalie nodded. She accepted the water. She pressed the paper towel against her palms and felt the sting of it and was almost grateful for the physical pain because it gave her something concrete to feel instead of the vast and shapeless fury and grief that was trying to swallow her whole. "Can I call someone for you?" Peggy asked. Peggy. Rosalie thought about Adriana, who was waiting in Los Angeles, who was 13 years old and who had already watched her mother lose things that could not be given back. She thought about her mother in Albuquerque, who would panic, who would want to get in a car and drive, and who was 67 years old and shouldn't be driving that far alone. She thought about calling someone and having to explain what had happened and hearing the particular silence on the other end of a phone line that meant the person you loved was trying to find the right words and couldn't, and having to reassure them that she was fine, she was okay, please don't worry. When she was sitting on the asphalt of a gas station parking lot in the middle of the desert with blood on her hands and no way to stand up. "No," she said. "Thank you. No." So she sat there. The sun was still merciless. The asphalt radiated heat like something alive. A few cars came and went from the gas station, and some of the drivers looked at her and some of them didn't, and none of them stopped. She thought about the word that one of those men had put close to her ear. She had heard worse in her life. She had dealt with ignorance and cruelty and the casual unkindness of a world that found disability inconvenient. But there was something about that word in that moment. Said that close. Said while he was taking something she needed to live her life. Said while his friends were laughing. That had reached past her defenses and landed somewhere very deep and very tender, in the place where she kept the version of herself that still, despite everything, wanted to believe that most people were decent. That version of herself was having a very hard afternoon. She heard the motorcycle before she saw it. Thomas Briggs had been called Bonesaw for so long that there were people in the Hells Angels Barstow chapter who didn't know his real name. The nickname had come from his years as a mechanic, specifically from his habit of using a reciprocating saw to cut through engine casings that other mechanics said were impossible to get into without the right equipment. Bonesaw didn't believe in waiting for the right equipment. He believed in finding a way. He was 54 years old. He had a face that looked like it had been around for approximately 70, not because of age exactly, but because of accumulated experience. The deep lines around his eyes were from years of riding into the wind, the scar along his jaw from a bar fight in 1998 that he never talked about, the gray in his beard from the last decade of a life that had not been quiet. He had hands the size of dinner plates, and a laugh that could rattle windows, and a reputation in 3 counties as a man you did not want to be on the wrong side of. He also, though fewer people knew this, had a daughter. Her name was Sylvie, and she was 26, and she lived in Phoenix and called him every Sunday. Not at noon, but in the evenings, usually after 8, when the day had settled and they could talk without rushing. She was a nurse. She had her mother's eyes, which were gray and serious, and his stubborn jaw, which she deployed against him regularly and effectively. She was the single best thing that had ever happened to Thomas Briggs, who had done many things in his life that he was not proud of, and a few things that he was, and the thing he was most proud of was raising a daughter who was kind and competent and genuinely good. He thought about Sylvie a lot when he rode. It was the kind of thinking you could only do on a motorcycle, with the wind taking everything that wasn't absolutely essential, and leaving just the quiet truth of what mattered. On the road, Bonesaw was stripped of everything that wasn't real. On the road, he knew exactly who he was and exactly what he valued. He'd been riding the 58 back toward Barstow from a run to Victorville when he stopped for gas. It was habit more than necessity. He'd had half a tank left, but the Shell station had a good bathroom and he was hungry, and there was something appealing about stopping, just for a few minutes, in the particular stillness that Barstow had in the late afternoon when the worst of the heat had passed. He pulled in off the highway, killed the engine, and saw her. She was sitting on the ground near the entrance, maybe 15 feet from the door. Her back was against a concrete pillar, and her legs were extended in front of her, and her hands resting in her lap, had paper towels against them that were going red. She was looking at nothing. Or rather, she was looking at the middle distance in the way that people look when they're not seeing what's in front of them but something inside themselves, something they can't stop looking at even though it hurts. Bonesaw sat on his bike for 3 seconds, not because he was deciding whether to help. He'd made that decision before his brain had fully caught up with what his eyes were telling him. He sat for 3 seconds because he was taking in the situation, the scrapes on her hands, the fact that she was on the ground with no clear reason to be on the ground, the absence of any wheelchair or mobility device, the look on her face that he recognized from too many years of too many hard things. That look was the look of someone who had been hurt deliberately. He got off the bike. He was a big man, 6'2", 240 pounds. And he moved the way very large men sometimes moved when they understood that their size could be frightening, which was carefully, with intention, giving people time to register that he was approaching and decide how they felt about it. He came around to a position where she could see him clearly before he got close. He stopped about 6 feet away. "Hey," he said. She looked up at him. Her eyes were red from crying, but they were also steady. There was something very particular about the steadiness in them, the look of a woman who had cried but was not going to be undone by it. The look of someone who had survived worse than this and knew it, even if right now it didn't feel that way. "Hey," she said back. Her voice was calm. That surprised him a little. Not because he'd expected hysteria, but because that level of calm under that level of visible pain was not something most people could manage. "You okay?" he asked, which was a stupid question, and he knew it was a stupid question, and the slight narrowing of her eyes told him that she knew it too. But he asked it anyway because sometimes you started with the stupid question just to open the door. "No," she said. "Not especially." He appreciated the honesty. He crouched down to her level, slow, deliberate, telegraphing the whole movement, and looked at her hands. "Those need cleaning," he said. "The station got a first aid kit?" "Peggy, the woman inside, already brought me some things." "Good. What happened?" she told him. "Not everything, not all at once." She gave him the shape of it first, the basic facts, and he listened without interrupting, which was not something that came naturally to him, but which he'd learned over decades was often the most useful thing you could do. As she talked, he watched her face and saw the things she wasn't saying underneath the things she was saying, and by the time she finished, he was so angry that he could feel it in his back teeth. "They took your chair," he said. "Yes." "And drove away?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who had nothing to say, but the quiet of someone choosing very deliberately between several possible responses and discarding the ones that would not be useful to this woman in this moment. "Okay," he said finally. "Let's start with getting you somewhere that isn't the ground." The first thing he did was go inside and talk to Peggy. Peggy, it turned out, had already called the police. She had also gotten a very clear image off the security camera of the truck's license plate. She had also, in the way of people who have worked gas stations for long years and seen a lot, already called the regional dispatch to flag the plate and give a description of the vehicle. She was 60 years old and had the manner of someone who had stopped waiting for other people to handle things a long time ago. "Good," Bonesaw said. "You got a folding chair? Anything she can sit in with some back support that isn't the asphalt?" Peggy produced a rolling stool from behind the counter. It wasn't much, but it was something. He brought it out and positioned it carefully near Rosalie, and, in the same methodical way, he approached every mechanical problem. What do we have? What do we need? What are the steps from here to there? Helped her transfer from the ground to the stool. He'd learned enough over the years, between Sylvie's medical education filtering down to him in bits and pieces and his own experience with injured riders, to know the right way to support someone during a transfer. How not to grab. How to offer resistance rather than force. How to let the person do as much of the work as possible while making sure they had something stable to hold on to. She was strong. He noticed that immediately. Her upper body strength was considerable. This was someone who had been using her arms to do what most people use their legs for long enough that it showed. She completed the transfer efficiently and without fuss. "Thank you," she said, settling onto the stool. More steadily than before. The ground, he understood, had been its own indignity. Getting up off it, even just onto a rolling stool, restored something. He went back inside. He bought 2 bottles of cold water and a proper first aid kit and came back out and sat on the ground in front of her. No chair, just the ground, because he'd be damned if he was going to stand over her while they talked, and cleaned the scrapes on her palms with more care than she probably expected from a man who looked the way he looked. "You're pretty good at this," she said, watching him. "My daughter's a nurse," he said. "I've learned things I never expected to learn." She almost smiled at that. Almost. "I need to call the police," she said. "And I need to figure out how to get to Los Angeles without a wheelchair. My daughter is there. She's waiting for me." She paused. "I have a backup manual chair at my sister's house in Victorville, but it would take hours," and she stopped. "I'm sorry. You don't need to hear all of this." "I've got nowhere to be," he said, which was true. "Tell me what you need." She looked at him, the steadiness in her eyes again, but with something else in it now. A careful, evaluating quality. The look of a woman who had learned not to take help for granted, or to take helpers at face value, because both tended to disappoint you. "Why?" she asked. It was a fair question. It was the right question. He'd have asked it himself. "Because 3 jackasses took something of yours for no reason except to watch you suffer," he said. "And that makes me angry. And when something makes me angry and there's something concrete I can do about it, I do it." He paused. "Also, I have a daughter your age. And if someone did to her what those men did to you, I would want someone to stop and help her. So." Rosalie Vega looked at this enormous, scarred, leather-jacketed man sitting cross-legged on a gas station parking lot floor, cleaning her scraped palms with the focused attention of someone who actually meant it, and made a decision. She told him what she needed. What followed was 3 hours of the most effective problem-solving Rosalie had witnessed in a long time. Bonesaw got on his phone. Not to call someone to fix the problem for him. To coordinate. He called the Barstow chapter. He called the Victorville chapter. He called a woman named Patricia, who turned out to be the coordinator for a disability services advocacy organization in San Bernardino County, whom Bonesaw knew through, of all things, his chapter's annual charity motorcycle run. "Patricia's going to know the fastest way to get a loaner wheelchair in this area," he told Rosalie, still on the ground, his phone balanced on his enormous knee. "She works with about 6 different organizations. Give me 5 minutes." 5 minutes later, he had located 2 options within 30 miles. One a medical supply store in Barstow that had a loaner program, and one a private individual through a disability equipment lending network who had a power chair she'd be willing to lend. "The power chair would be better for your drive," he said. "Better for loading. The manual needs someone with you who can—" "I drive alone," Rosalie said, and there was something in the way she said it that communicated a whole history. "Power chair it is," he said, and got back on the phone. While he was arranging the chair, Peggy came back out to tell them that the police had called back. The license plate had come back registered to a vehicle belonging to a Shane Purcell, address in Needles, and 2 officers were already en route to question him. Rosalie said nothing for a moment. Bonesaw watched her. "They'll get a warning," she said. "Maybe a citation. Nothing will actually happen." "Maybe," he said. Maybe not. She looked at him sideways. What does that mean? It means, he said carefully, that police citations are one thing, and community memory is another, and those aren't the same thing. She waited. He didn't elaborate. He went back to his phone. She would understand what he meant later. She would understand it better than she expected. The woman with the power chair was named Dolores, and she arrived in under an hour with her husband Eduardo in their minivan with the wheelchair ramp. And when Dolores climbed out, she took one look at Rosalie and opened her arms and said, "Come here, mija," in a voice so full of maternal heat that Rosalie, who had been holding herself together with considerable discipline for going on 2 hours, made a sound that was very close to a sob. She didn't fully cry, but it was close. Dolores was 60 years old and had been using a wheelchair herself for 15 years, and she and Rosalie spent 20 minutes talking in the way that people with shared experience talk. Shorthand and recognition and the particular efficiency of not having to explain yourself because the other person already knows. The power chair was newer and heavier than Rosalie's own, but Dolores walked her through it methodically, and by the end of the 20 minutes, Rosalie was navigating the parking lot with confidence. Eduardo had brought sandwiches because, as he explained with the matter-of-fact generosity of a man who had been married to Dolores for 32 years, she always says you can't help someone properly if you don't feed them first. He offered one to Bonesaw, who took it without ceremony and ate it, standing up in the way of a man entirely comfortable eating a sandwich in a gas station parking lot. "I can get to Los Angeles now," Rosalie said. She looked at Bonesaw. "You arranged all of this." "I made some calls," he said, "in 3 hours. I know people." She shook her head, not in disbelief but in something more complicated. The particular expression of someone who has been shown a kindness large enough to be disorienting, when they had arrived at the situation braced for nothing but more pain. "The chair situation is temporary," Dolores said, squeezing Rosalie's hand. "But we're going to find your chair too. You understand? We're not letting this go." Here is what Thomas Briggs had not told Rosalie because he did not want to raise expectations he couldn't guarantee. He had, while making his calls, mentioned the license plate to 3 specific people in his network. Not to ask them to do anything specific, just to mention it, just to let it be known. This was something that happened sometimes in communities like his. Information moved in particular ways through particular channels, and people who had their own reasons to care about a specific category of wrongdoing had ways of making sure that wrongdoing did not quietly disappear. Disability rights communities worked the same way, as he'd discovered over the years through his chapter's charity work. They were organized, they were connected. They were deeply, personally invested in the idea that acts of cruelty toward disabled people should have consequences. Because they knew from long and specific experience that without active community response, the consequences were often nothing. By the time Rosalie was on the highway heading west toward Los Angeles, the incident at the Shell station outside Barstow had been posted to 3 disability advocacy social media groups, 1 motorcycle community page, and a local news tip line. Peggy's security footage, which captured the entire incident with painful clarity, had been provided, legally, to both police and media. By the next morning, the footage had been viewed 400,000 times. By the morning after that, it was a national story. Rosalie heard about it from Adriana, who called her at 7 in the morning while Rosalie was still in the hotel room in Los Angeles. She'd arrived late, too tired to do anything except eat the food Adriana had kept for her and let her daughter hold her hand and not say anything, which was what they both needed. "Mom," Adriana said, "your video is everywhere." "My video?" "The gas station. It's everywhere. There's an article. There's like 4 articles. Mom, 300 people have commented already and they're—" She paused, in the way of 13-year-olds processing information faster than their emotional vocabulary could keep up with. "Mom, they're really, really angry. Like, on your behalf. Like they all— Audrey. They found the guys, Mom. The police found them. And apparently there's a news van outside their house." Rosalie sat with that for a moment. She thought about the man in the parking lot, sitting on the ground so she didn't have to look up at him. She thought about the way he'd cleaned her palms. She thought about those 3 words, "I know people," delivered without any drama, as a simple statement of fact. "Okay," she said. "Okay, Mom, this is big." "I know," she said. "But right now the big thing is your science fair. Tell me about your rocket." The 3 men, Shane Purcell, 22, and his two friends Garrett Webb and Colton Marsh, both 23, were interviewed by police that same evening. The security footage made denial impossible. They had, apparently, expected the whole thing to be forgotten by morning. Shane Purcell had posted about it on his own social media before deleting it when the calls started coming. He was too late. Screenshots have a life of their own. The charges filed initially were theft and aggravated assault. Theft because of the wheelchair, aggravated because of Rosalie's disability and the deliberate targeting. Her attorney, she found one through the Disability Advocacy Network within 48 hours, pro bono, was confident about the theft. Less confident about the assault charge sticking as filed, but working on it. All three lost their jobs within a week, not because anyone orchestrated it, because their employers saw the footage and made their own decisions. Rosalie followed the legal process with the focused attention of someone who had spent years watching other people navigate institutional systems and knew exactly how many ways those systems could fail you. She was not naive about outcomes. She was realistic, but she was also, for the first time since September, not alone in it. He went alone. He didn't tell anyone from the chapter he was going because he didn't need backup and he didn't want to create a situation that could be mischaracterized. He went on a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after the incident, when he knew, because he'd done his homework, because Bonesaw believed in doing his homework, that Shane Purcell would be home. He knocked on the door. Shane Purcell answered it looking like a man who had spent 2 weeks being confronted by the consequences of something he'd thought was harmless, which is to say he looked exhausted and defensive and deeply stupid in the way of people who had mistaken cruelty for humor and were only now beginning to understand the difference. He looked at Bonesaw. Bonesaw looked at him. "You have a wheelchair," Bonesaw said. "In your truck, or somewhere. I'd like it back." Shane Purcell stared at him for a long moment. "I don't know what your son," Bonesaw said very quietly. "I've been doing this a long time. I know what a guilty face looks like. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here because a woman needed her chair back and I told her I'd get it for her and I keep my word. So, where is it?" There was a long silence. "The shed," Shane Purcell said. It was in the shed. The wheelchair was dirty and one of the push rims was slightly bent. They'd apparently tried at some point to ride it as a gag, but it was structurally intact. Bonesaw checked it carefully in the way of a mechanic checking something that had been in careless hands, cataloging the damage. The bent rim was fixable. He knew a guy. He loaded the chair in the back of the pickup truck he'd borrowed for exactly this purpose. He started to leave. "Hey," Shane Purcell said from the door. He sounded different now, younger. The defensive quality had drained out of him. "Is she okay?" Bonesaw turned around. He stood there for a moment, looking at this 22-year-old who had done something genuinely terrible and was now, maybe for the first time, having to hold that fact still and look at it. "You want to know if she's okay," Bonesaw said. "She's alive. She's managing. She's had 3 years of practice managing things she shouldn't have to manage." He paused. "Here's what I want you to think about. Not today, maybe, but at some point. That woman. She works with people who've lost the use of their limbs. She helps them rebuild. She has a daughter who looks up to her. She was driving to Los Angeles to watch her kid compete in a science fair when you stopped and decided she was funny." He let that sit. "She wasn't funny. She was a person who has already had to fight for things that you've never had to think about for 30 seconds of your life. And you made her sit on the ground with bloody hands in the September heat and you laughed at her. So no, she's not okay in the way you're hoping to hear, but she's moving forward because that's what she does. And you're going to have to decide what you do with the knowledge of what you took from her, even if only for an afternoon." "What you took?" He got in the truck. He drove back to Barstow. He had the rim repaired by Tuesday. She had, against all logic, expected that to be the end of it. She'd heard about the chair through Patricia, the disability advocate, who'd gotten a call from Bonesaw. She'd called to thank him, and he'd said something brief and deflective about it being nothing, and she'd let him deflect because she could tell it was what he needed, and she'd thought, "That's probably the last I'll hear from him." She had not expected him to show up to Adriana's science fair, not the school fair, the regional competition, the one in Los Angeles. The one that Adriana had been preparing for since June and that Rosalie had been driving toward when everything went wrong. Adriana won second place in her division, which was tremendous, which was the kind of thing that made Rosalie cry in a completely different way. The good way, the proud way, the way that reminded you that the world was also full of this. of your child doing the impossible and grinning at you from across a gymnasium. Afterward, in the parking lot, Rosalie saw the Harley first and felt her heart do something odd. And then she saw him, standing about 50 feet away next to his bike in a posture that communicated very deliberately that he was not approaching unless she indicated she wanted him to, giving her the choice, the way he'd given her the choice in everything. She crossed the parking lot toward him. "You drove to Los Angeles for a science fair," she said. "I was passing through," he said. "No, you weren't." He almost smiled. "No, I wasn't." She shook her head. "How did you even know when it was?" "Patricia," he said. "She mentioned it." "I might have asked." Rosalie looked at him for a long moment, at the lines around his eyes from decades of riding into wind, at the hands that had cleaned her palms so carefully on a concrete floor outside a gas station in the middle of the desert, at the person behind the face that the world looked at and saw one thing, and which was, she was learning, something considerably more complicated. "Do you want to meet my daughter?" she asked. He looked startled. Actually startled, the first time she'd seen his composure shift like that. Yeah, he said. Yeah. She called Adriana over. Adriana looked at Bonesaw with the frank, unfiltered assessment of a 13-year-old and said, "You're the guy who got Mom's chair back." "That's me," he said. "She told me about you," Adriana said. "She said you sat on the ground so she wouldn't have to look up at you." Bonesaw glanced at Rosalie. Something moved in his expression, something that had no name but that Rosalie would think about later, in the quiet of the hotel room, and understand as recognition. The look of someone who had been seen more clearly than they expected and didn't entirely know what to do with it. "Yeah," he said. Adriana nodded with the solemnity of a 13-year-old delivering a verdict. That was the right thing to do. "I know," he said. "I've got a daughter too. She teaches me things." They kept in touch, not in a dramatic way, not in the way of stories where things happen fast and big and the emotional logic demands immediate resolution, in the way of real things, slowly, carefully, with the full weight of both their histories present and acknowledged and not hidden. He texted sometimes, mostly links, articles about wheelchair accessibility legislation, a news story about an adaptive cycling program, once, memorably, a photo of a sign outside a biker bar in Nevada that said accessible entrance in rear, all rides welcome, which made her laugh for the first time in a while. She texted back, sometimes about things related to the incident, the legal process, which moved with the agonizing slowness of all legal processes, and sometimes about other things. About a patient who had made a breakthrough after months of plateaus. About a book she was reading. About the garden that never got enough attention. He told her about Sylvie. About the Sunday evening calls. About the particular pride of watching your child become a person you genuinely admired. She told him about the accident. Not the facts of it. She'd told him those in the parking lot, briefly. The deeper things. What it had felt like to wake up and be told about managing expectations. What it had felt like to return to work and discover that now she could help people in a way she hadn't been able to before. What it had felt like, sitting on that gas station floor, to have the particular shame of a public humiliation add its weight to a life that already carried more than its share. He listened. He didn't offer solutions or silver linings. He just listened in the way of someone who understood that the listening was the point. Once, she asked him, "What made you stop? A lot of people drove past." He was quiet for a moment. "I have a daughter," he said, "and I've ridden past a lot of things in my life that I shouldn't have. I got tired of being the kind of person who keeps riding." She thought about that for a long time. The legal case settled 8 months after the incident. Shane Purcell pleaded to aggravated theft and misdemeanor assault. He received a sentence that included community service, 300 hours, specifically with a disability services organization in the Needles area, the judge having decided that proximity to the people he'd wronged was more instructive than distance from them. Garrett Webb and Colton Marsh received lesser charges, lesser sentences. Rosalie attended the sentencing hearing. She gave a victim impact statement. She had written it over 3 weeks, in the early mornings before Adriana woke up at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold while she wrote. She did not write about anger. She wrote about her daughter. About the morning after the incident when Adriana had climbed into bed next to her in the hotel room and said very quietly, "Mom, are you okay?" And Rosalie had said yes, and Adriana had said, "You don't have to say yes if you're not. and Rosalie had held her daughter for a long time without saying anything at all. She wrote about her patients, about the people who came to her after catastrophic loss and had to learn to trust their bodies again, to trust the world again, about how much energy that required, about how any act of cruelty, any act that said your body makes you lesser, your mobility makes you lesser, your struggle is something to be laughed at, stole energy from that already exhausting work. She wrote about sitting on the ground. She wrote, "What you did to me on that afternoon was not merely theft. It was a statement. It said that my body, in the state it is in, makes me fair game. It said that my struggle is entertainment. It said that I am not fully a person in your eyes. I want you to understand how much energy it takes every single day to move through a world that says that, in its architecture, in its attitudes, in the way people look past you or through you or at you as a problem to be managed, and to continue believing, in spite of all of that you deserve to take up space. What you did made that harder, not forever, but for longer than you intended." She paused in her writing. Then she added, "I want you to know that I'm still here. I'm still moving forward. And I want you to think about what kind of person you want to be when someone like me crosses your path again. Because we will. We always do. And you will have a choice." The judge read the statement into the record. The courtroom was quiet. Shane Purcell in the defendant's chair was crying. Whether from remorse or consequence, Rosalie could not say with certainty, and she was honest enough with herself not to claim to know. Bonesaw was in the gallery. He had driven from Barstow. He sat in the third row in the back, and he did not say anything, and he did not need to. 6 months after the sentencing, Rosalie published an essay in a national disability magazine. It was about the incident, yes, but it was about something larger, about the specific exhaustion of being disabled in a world built for able bodies, about the difference between accommodation and welcome, about what it meant to be seen, about an unlikely stranger on a motorcycle who had sat on the ground because the ground was where she was. The essay was read, shared, and eventually cited in 2 different state legislative discussions about disability hate crime provisions. Bonesaw read it on his phone one Sunday evening, sitting on the back porch of his house in Barstow, waiting for Sylvie to call. He read it twice. He didn't have words for what it did to him, which was unusual. He was not, despite his reputation, a man without words. But sometimes things hit in places where words weren't built yet. He texted Rosalie, "Read it. You did something important." She texted back, "We both did. Don't forget the part you played." He stared at that for a while. Then Sylvie called, and he answered, and he told her about it. Haltingly, because he was not always good at this, but honestly, because he'd learned that honesty with his daughter was more important than the comfort of keeping things private. "She wrote about you, didn't she?" Sylvie said. It was not a question. "She wrote about that day," he said. "Same thing." He could hear the smile in his daughter's voice. "Dad, you did good." "I sat on the ground and made some phone calls." "Dad, you did good." He looked out at the desert, at the sky going orange and purple over the flat land, at the specific beauty of a place that most people drove through without seeing. He thought about all the things he'd ridden past in his life, all the things he hadn't stopped for when maybe he should have, all the years he'd spent being a particular kind of person, and then the slow, unglamorous work of becoming a different kind, one decision at a time. "Yeah," he said, "maybe I did." There are things in this story that belong to Adriana alone. She was 13. She was building rockets and growing up in the complicated way of children who have watched their parents endure real things and come out the other side not smaller but different, more specific, more aware, carrying something in them that kids who grow up in easier circumstances don't always carry. She knew about the accident. She'd been 10 when it happened. She had been at a friend's birthday party when the call came, and the mother of her friend had driven her to the hospital, and she had sat in a waiting room for 4 hours before anyone could tell her anything definitive. She remembered the color of the chairs in that waiting room. She remembered the sound of the vending machine down the hall. She remembered a cartoon playing on a television in the corner with the sound turned down, characters moving in pantomime, their expressions unconnected to any context she could follow. She had never told her mother about the waiting room. Not the details. She'd protected her mother from it, in the way children sometimes protect parents from the depth of their fear, intuiting that some information was more useful kept inside than shared. She had grown up since then doing a particular kind of watching, watching her mother's strength and her mother's grief and her mother's fierce ongoing insistence on doing everything, participating fully, refusing to be diminished. She had watched that and absorbed it, and understood it was both a gift and a cost. The afternoon of the incident, she'd been in Los Angeles setting up her display when her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. Stopped for gas. Small delay. See you tonight. It had been casual enough that Adriana hadn't worried, which had been, she understood later, the deliberate work of a woman who had spent 3 years calibrating what to reveal to her daughter and what to carry alone. She'd found out from the news like everyone else, which had been its own kind of shock. She had sat in the hotel room the night her mother arrived and held her mother's hand and not asked any questions because some things didn't need questions. And then, in the morning, she'd woken up early and been on the phone with people she'd learned were called disability advocates and community resources, and she'd written down names and numbers in her notebook, and when her mother woke up, she'd put the notebook on the table and said, "I did some research. These are people who can help." Her mother had looked at the notebook for a long time. "When did you become this person?" Rosalie had asked. "I learned from you," Adriana had said, which was the truth and which was also a complicated thing to say at 7 in the morning in a Los Angeles hotel room with the weight of the previous day still in the air between them. She met Bonesaw in the parking lot after the science fair and she assessed him with 13-year-old directness and decided, quickly and completely, that he was real. This was a skill she had developed from years of watching adults present themselves to her mother, the helpers who were really performing helpfulness, the supporters who needed the approval of helping more than the helped needed their help, and distinguishing them from the people who were actually present without an agenda. Bonesaw had no agenda. That was obvious in 30 seconds. What he had was a kind of stillness, a quality of being very fully where he was, that Adriana recognized because her mother had it too. The quality of people who had been through enough real things that they no longer needed to perform for an audience. She didn't fully articulate this until later. At the time, she just thought, "This one is real." And she shook his hand and told him about the rocket, and he asked questions that were actually curious rather than merely polite, and she answered them. And by the time they said goodbye, she had the sense that something had shifted, some small but load-bearing thing in the architecture of their lives, and that it was probably going to be okay. She told her best friend about it later that night. Her best friend, whose name was Priya and who was precociously observant in the way of daughters of pediatricians, listened to the whole story and then said, "He sounds like a dad." Adriana thought about that. "He sounds like someone who knows what matters," she said finally. Priya considered this. "Same thing," she said. Adriana went home and texted her mom. "Do you like him?" Rosalie texted back, "He's a friend." "Why?" Adriana texted, "Just asking." She put her phone down and went back to her rocket modifications and didn't think about it anymore. Except that she did. She thought about it the way you think about things you're not ready to fully examine yet. At the edges, in passing, leaving it alone until it was ready. Here is something that doesn't get said enough about people like Thomas Briggs. The Hells Angels as an organization has a reputation that is both deserved in some ways and simplistic in others. They have done things, collectively and individually, that are hard to defend. The history is complicated and anyone who tells you otherwise is either uninformed or dishonest. But communities are complicated, all of them. And within any complicated community there are people who are simply, genuinely, in the business of showing up for others. People whose loyalty, however it was forged, whatever its origins, is real and extending and sometimes extends to strangers who happen to be in the right parking lot at the right moment. Bonesaw had spent 30 years in the Hells Angels. He had done things in those 30 years that he had made a private accounting of, an accounting that was honest and not gentle to himself, and he had decided, not in one dramatic moment but over a long, accumulating period of small decisions, to spend the rest of his life on the other side of the ledger. Not to balance it out, because some things don't balance out, but to make the rest of his time worth something real. The charity runs his chapter organized raised money for children's hospitals and food banks and, after his friendship with Patricia developed, increasingly for disability services and accessibility projects. They were not soft about it. You did not do charity runs in the Hells Angels by being soft, but they were genuine. They showed up with the same force and commitment they had historically applied to less constructive purposes, and they applied it to building ramps and funding equipment and making sure that people who needed things had a pathway to getting them. Bonesaw did not tell Rosalie most of this. Not because he was hiding it, but because he was not a man who explained himself unless someone asked directly. He didn't need her to know. He didn't need the credit. She found out from Patricia eventually and called him about it. "You funded the equipment lending network," she said. "The one where Dolores had the chair. You funded it." "The chapter contributed," he said. "It was a group thing. But you started it." A pause. "I suggested it to the chapter, a couple years ago, after a run I did where we passed through a town that had—" He stopped. There was a kid, in a manual chair with wheels that barely turned. His family couldn't afford a replacement. We passed through and I thought— He stopped again. "I went back. That's all." "You went back," she repeated. "Yeah." She was quiet. "Bonesaw," she said. "Yeah." "I'm glad you stopped at that gas station." He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if the call had dropped. Then, "Me too." In the spring after the sentencing, Rosalie planted tomatoes. This was not, on the surface, significant. She had had a garden for years, had had one before the accident, and had maintained it, with modifications after. The beds were raised now to a height she could reach from her chair, and the pathways between them were widened and paved. And the whole arrangement was the product of an afternoon she and Adriana had spent redesigning the backyard with a level and a tape measure and a determination that being in a wheelchair was not going to mean not having fresh tomatoes. But this spring she also planted something else. Sunflowers along the south fence, which was not something she'd grown before. She wasn't entirely sure why she chose sunflowers. Something about the specific, unambiguous way they turned toward light. Something about their size, the extravagance of them, the unapologetic bigness. Something about wanting to plant something that would be impossible to overlook. She sent Bonesaw a photo when they came up in July. He responded almost immediately. "Those are enormous." She wrote back, "They're supposed to be." He wrote, "Like you." She stared at that for a moment. Then she put the phone down and went back to the garden and did not think about it. Except she did. She thought about it in the same edgewise way she'd been thinking about things for months. Carefully, peripherally, leaving it alone. Adriana, who had been reading in the garden and had seen the exchange over her mother's shoulder in the way of teenagers with excellent peripheral vision, said nothing. She had learned from her mother that some things were worth waiting for. 8 months after the incident, Bonesaw called Rosalie. "I have a project," he said. "I could use your expertise." The project was a community center in Barstow, a nonprofit that ran after-school programs and food assistance that wanted to expand its accessibility. Their budget was limited. Their building was old. Their existing ramp was, as Bonesaw described it with the professional displeasure of a mechanic looking at bad work, technically meets the old code minimum and practically is useless. Rosalie had been doing consulting work on accessibility for 3 years, between her clinical hours. She drove out to Barstow the following Saturday. It was the first time she'd been back since September. The gas station was on the highway she took. She drove past it. She registered it. She felt something. Not the sharp thing she'd felt in the immediate aftermath, but a flatter, older feeling, like scar tissue where there used to be wound. Not healed, but changed. Different. The community center was a squat building from the 1970s with the look of something that had been built quickly and maintained with love, which was not the same as being maintained well. The parking lot had an irregular surface. The front entrance had a ramp that someone had added as an afterthought, bolted to the existing stairs at an angle that made it technically navigable and practically terrifying. Bonesaw met her out front. He was in jeans and a work jacket rather than his cut, which she noticed and didn't comment on, and he had a clipboard with measurements and a look of concentrated professional frustration. "So," he said, "tell me how bad it is." She navigated the ramp. She catalogued what she found. They spent 4 hours in the building, him taking notes, her identifying every problem, every barrier, every place where someone in a wheelchair or using a walker or with limited mobility would encounter friction. There was a lot of friction. She wrote a detailed assessment. She recommended specific modifications and, more importantly, specific contractors and programs that could fund them. She called Patricia. She called 3 different organizations she'd built relationships with since the incident. She leveraged 6 months of connection building in the disability advocacy community in ways that she would not have had the connections to do a year ago. By the end of the day, they had a plan. They ate dinner at a diner near the highway. Not because it was the best option, but because it was close and accessible, and they were tired and hungry in the way of people who had done real work. Bonesaw ate a burger the size of his face. Rosalie ate a bowl of soup and a piece of cornbread and drank 2 cups of coffee. They talked for 3 hours. Not about the project. The project was settled. The plan was made. They talked about other things. About his time in the club, the parts he'd carry with him and the parts he'd walked away from, and the complicated math of both. About her work. The patients who broke her heart, and the ones who rebuilt it, and the ones who did both at the same time. About Sylvie and Adriana. About the garden. About the specific beauty of the Mojave in the early morning before the heat arrived, which was something they had both separately experienced. At one point she said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yeah." "That day, when you drove in and saw me on the ground." She paused. "Before you came over, you stopped on your bike for a moment. I saw you. What were you thinking?" He looked at his coffee for a moment. "I was thinking about all the times I didn't stop," he said. "Not that specific situation, just in general. Times I kept riding when I should have pulled over. Times I looked away because it was easier." He paused. "I've been trying to not do that anymore. So when I see something where stopping is the right thing, I try to stop before I can talk myself out of it." Rosalie nodded. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I'm glad you didn't talk yourself out of it," she said. "Me too," he said. Outside, the desert dark had settled over Barstow. Through the diner window she could see the highway stretching out toward the darkness in both directions. The same highway she'd pulled off when everything went wrong. The same desert. Different night. She thought about how a life could contain both of those things, the worst afternoon and the thing that came after, and how one didn't cancel out the other, and how the second one didn't make the first one okay, but how they were both part of the same story, and how that story, held whole, was actually something she wanted to claim. 3 years after the accident, 1 year after Barstow, she knows this. She knows that her body is not a tragedy. This was the hardest thing to learn, not because she'd been told it was a tragedy. She was too smart for that, and her mother had raised her with too much steel. But because the world is designed in ways that make you feel like it is. Every inaccessible entrance is a statement. Every parking space without a ramp cut is a statement. Every person who looks at the wheelchair before they look at the face is a statement. The cumulative weight of all those statements is not nothing. It took real work to refuse them. She knows that asking for help is not weakness. She knew this intellectually before. She'd counseled patients on this for years. But knowing it in the body, in the lived reality of having to ask, and having to let someone help, and having to be grateful without shame, is different. She knows it now in the way that only experience can teach. She knows that cruelty is not inevitable. That people will do terrible things, and other people will stop on a motorcycle in the middle of the desert and sit on the ground next to you and clean your hands. That both things happen in the same world, sometimes in the same parking lot. And that one does not cancel the other, but that choosing which one you build your life around matters enormously. She knows that her daughter is going to be okay. More than okay. The evidence is Adriana coming home from school and announcing that she started an accessibility audit of her high school building. The evidence is the list in Adriana's notebook. The evidence is Priya texting Rosalie to ask if Adriana can come to an organizing meeting for a youth disability advocacy group they've both decided to join. The evidence is her daughter becoming exactly who she'd hoped she'd become, through circumstances Rosalie would never have chosen. She knows that some things are worth not rushing. He knows that the ledger doesn't balance. That is the first and most important thing. He doesn't carry the past lightly, and he doesn't pretend it's behind him completely. It walks with him. He's learned to walk with it rather than run from it, which is different and harder and more honest. He knows that his daughter is the best thing he's ever done, and that most of the best thing happened in spite of him, through her own character and her mother's steadiness, and that his role was mostly to not get in the way of who she was becoming while trying to become someone better himself. He knows that there is a particular kind of usefulness that comes from being seen as dangerous. Not the kind that used to motivate him, not the power and the fear. The other kind. The kind where you show up in a situation and your presence alone changes the geometry of it. The kind where 3 men who would laugh at a woman on the ground would not, he was certain, have laughed in the same way if he'd been there when it happened. He can't be everywhere. He knows this. No one can. But he can stop when he sees something. He can get off the bike. He can sit on the ground. He can make the calls. He can go back with a borrowed truck and no backup and knock on a door and say, "You have something that isn't yours." He knows that Rosalie is the most interesting person he's talked to in years. He knows this, and he doesn't say it out loud because saying it would change something, and the thing that would be changed is something he's not ready to change yet, because it is also, in its current form, very good. He knows that Sylvie, who knows everything about him and loves him anyway, would have things to say about this that he's not ready to hear. He knows the sunflowers in Rosalie's garden are extravagant and exactly right. The community center ramp was completed in April. It was, objectively, a good ramp. Wide and gently graded with proper handrails and a smooth surface and a landing at the top that gave you room to turn. Entirely unremarkable, in the way that good accessibility always is. Present, functional, invisible in its correctness, so that the building simply worked for everyone without anyone having to fight for it or accommodate themselves to its failures. They had a small ceremony for the opening. The director of the community center, a woman named Francesca who ran the nonprofit with the focused energy of someone who had decided that doing good was a full-contact sport, had organized it. There were folding chairs and a table of food and a dozen kids from the after-school program who were there because Francesca believed that every good thing that happened in the building should be witnessed by the kids the building served. Bonesaw stood to one side, not in the photos, declining every attempt to put him in the center of anything. Patricia was there and spoke about accessibility and community and the difference between legal minimums and genuine welcome. Rosalie was there and did not speak formally, but moved through the crowd in the way she moved through all spaces, with attention, making eye contact, stopping to actually talk rather than just to be present. One of the kids, a boy of about 11 with leg braces and crutches who had been navigating the old ramp with daily heroics that no one had apparently acknowledged, walked up the new ramp twice and then turned around and walked down, and then stood at the bottom and looked up at Bonesaw. "You built this?" the kid asked. "We all built it," Bonesaw said. "Lot of people." "But you started it?" Bonesaw glanced at Rosalie, who was watching with a small smile. "She started it," he said, nodding toward Rosalie. "I just made some calls." The kid looked at Rosalie, then back at Bonesaw, then at the ramp. "It's a good ramp," he said, and walked up it again. Bonesaw watched him go. There was something happening in his chest that he didn't have a clean name for. Satisfaction was part of it. But satisfaction was too thin a word for what it was. It was the feeling, and he'd had it before, rarely, in moments scattered across a life that had contained too many other kinds of moments, of having done something that would outlast the moment itself. Something that would still be true tomorrow and next week and next year when he was somewhere else on the road. The kid would use that ramp every day and the ramp would work, and that was real in a way that many things weren't. Rosalie appeared beside him. "Good ramp," she said. "Good ramp," he agreed. They stood there for a moment, watching the kids run up and down it with the joyful thoroughness of children testing a new thing. "I want to do more of this," Rosalie said. "More projects like this. I'm thinking about expanding the consulting work, making it more systematic. Not just individual buildings, but working with communities on accessibility planning before they build. The kind of thing where you don't have to go back and fix it because it was right the first time." He nodded. "You'd be good at that." "I know people who could help," she said, "including you, if you wanted." He looked at her. "I know something about connecting people and resources," he said carefully, "and I know how to get things built." "Yes," she said, "you do." Outside, the April sun was warm without being harsh yet. The desert in spring had a brief and vivid quality, everything green at the edges before the summer burned it back to brown. A kid was explaining the ramp to another kid in the precise and serious way of children who had just discovered something important. Francesca was taking photos. Patricia was on the phone. "I'm going to be in Fresno next month," Bonesaw said. "Passing through on the way to—" He stopped. "You're not passing through anything," Rosalie said. A beat. "No," he admitted. "I'm not." She looked at him for a long moment, at the lines and the scars and the gray and the enormous careful hands and the person inside all of that who sat on the ground of gas station parking lots so that he wasn't looking down. "Come to Fresno," she said. "I'll show you the garden." He said yes. This is not a story about the absence of cruelty. The cruelty happened. It is documented. It is part of the permanent record of that Tuesday in September. This is not a story about cruelty being erased. Rosalie will carry what happened in that parking lot for the rest of her life, not as wound, but as knowledge. The specific, embodied knowledge of what it costs to sit on the ground with bloody hands while the world drives past. This is a story about what happens next. About a man on a motorcycle who had spent decades being one kind of person and was, slowly and without announcement, becoming another. About a woman who had learned to ask for things she needed without apologizing for the need. About a ramp that works. About a 13-year-old with a notebook. About sunflowers along the south fence that nobody can overlook. It is a story about the difference between looking and seeing, between driving past and pulling over, between the 30 seconds it takes to make a choice and the lifetime that follows from it. Somewhere in Barstow, Thomas Briggs is sitting on his back porch watching the desert go dark at the end of the day. His phone will ring soon. It's almost 8, and Sylvie calls at 8. He'll tell her something true, and she'll tell him something true back, and they'll be quiet together for a moment. The way of two people who understand each other. Somewhere in Fresno, Rosalie Vega is in her garden at the end of the afternoon, the light going gold and slant across the raised beds, the tomatoes coming in, the sunflowers enormous and ridiculous and perfect along the south fence. Adriana is inside with her notebook and Priya on the phone. Carmen called at noon and talked for 45 minutes. The garden needed attention and got it today. The world is what it is. Full of people who grab wheelchairs and full of people who give them back. Full of parking lots where terrible things happen and full of parking lots where a motorcycle pulls in at exactly the right moment. The question has never been whether the world contains cruelty. The question is what you do when you see it. The question is whether you stop. Thomas Briggs stopped. And everything that matters in this story, the chair returned, the ramp built, the woman in the garden with the extravagant sunflowers, the girl with the notebook, the ramp that a kid walks up without having to be a hero to do it, all of it flows from that single decision. Get off the bike, sit on the ground, do the work. That's what it takes. That's all it takes. And it's everything. End.